Hello again. I'm Billy Rhyze. And today, I'm going to show how I build larger cradled artist panels that require a bit of structural support underneath. These are panels that exceed 16 inches in any direction, and need reinforcements to ensure structural integrity over time. If you haven't already watched my other video, The Best Cradled Artist Panels You Can Build, I recommend doing so. It covers some key techniques that are skipped over here. Here is a detailed dimensional drawing of the cradled art panel we'll be making. These files are available to download and modify as you see fit. All source material is absolutely free. The link to download is in the description. Once again, I'm using my 45-degree angle cut sled to cut side one of the cradle's outer frame by raising the blade about 1/8 inch above the stock. Be sure to mark the top side of each cut, so you don't forget which side of the jig it was cut on. After making the first angled cut, measure and mark the total length of the stock needed. Be sure to mark the square cut line and the corresponding angle cut line. This is our visual gauge that we'll use to be sure that our cut is accurate, as it goes through the blade. Mark the top side of the second cut. Then repeat these steps for all the pieces on the cut list. Once you have all the pieces cut, we need to mark the location for the 3/4 inch dado cuts through the centers of each of the pieces. The dado cuts will lock in the cross bracing once fully assembled and add strength to the finish assembly. It's easy to forget which side of the stock the dado cut needs to go on. So when I'm laying out my lines, I mark the side that faces up while making the cut. The side that faces down into the saw blade, I'll mark with an X. Using my homemade cross-cut sled, I've raised the table saw blade 1/4 inch proud of the sled surface. After testing the blade depth on a scrap piece of wood, I cut out the area marked in the center of each piece. Then test the fit using some scrap. If the poplar stock doesn't fit into the dado, I take it back to the table saw and slowly carve out little bits on each end until the test fit is snug. I do this for all 4 sides of the cradle. Then, I cut the pieces that will become the cross bracing in the center. One piece is cut at 31 inches. The other is cut at 20 1/2 inches. Next, we'll need to mark where our cut lines will be, so that we can build the structural cross lap bracing on the back. Here, I've laid out my marks and transferred the lines around the stock, so that I can use the lines as a visual gauge when running the wood through the blade. We need to remove half the material for each cross brace piece. And we need to be precise in our cuts. Too much material removed will result in a weak glue joint. Too little material removed and the joint won't sit flush, which will cause problems later on. So, to avoid that, I'm going to show you my trick for setting the blade height perfect every time. To set the blade height, first we'll need a scrap piece of wood the same thickness as the cradle. Then, we'll measure and mark a center line down the length. Be sure to transfer that line around the end. Set your scrap on top of your cross-cut sled surface, and raise the blade up slowly, until the saw tooth is even with the marked line. Run a test cut to check for accuracy. Raise or lower the blade and perform test cuts until you've found the perfect blade height. When satisfied with your adjustments, cut out the marked portion of the 2 center rails until the pieces interlock with a snug fit. Once you're done, you should have all the parts necessary to start building the cradle. Next, we're going to start the glue-up assembly. But due to the size of this panel, we're going to encounter some unique problems we didn't have while building our basic art panel in my last video. Not to worry, I'll show you the tricks I used to resolve those issues along the way. Before we start the glue up, it's best to make sure we dry fit all the parts together. Here I'm using my ratcheting corner clamps again, with a ratchet mechanism on the long side. Notice how it is slightly off center from where the cross brace is located. I'll show you why that is in just a moment. But for now, let's remove the cross bracing so that we can glue up the outer walls of the cradle frame. Glue the ends and spread the glue around so that there's even coverage. Keep a damp rag handy to clean up the squeeze out once the clamp is set. Glue up all 4 corners, and slowly start applying pressure, making sure all the corners are aligned and that there's no gaps between the mitered edges. Clean up as much squeezed out glue around the joints as possible using the damp rag. Then, set it aside to dry. Next we'll work on the cross bracing for the back. Use some glue in the lap joint notches we made, and gently hammer the pieces into place. It's best to use a mallet or non-marring hammer, although a standard hammer and a scrap piece of wood to tap on will also work. Here I'm using some homemade 90-degree angle clamping jigs, to make sure the cross braces are square while drying. Once clamped, I allow sufficient enough time for it to dry. Next we'll glue it into the main cradle frame, then we'll be ready for the final steps. After allowing the cross bracing time to set up overnight, I removed the clamps and corner jigs to test fit the piece once more. Apply glue to the dado cuts on the inside of the cradle frame. While the glue is wet, use a rubber mallet to gently tap the cross bracing into place. Be sure to work your way around the cross bracing. Hammer in each arm of the brace a little at a time. Don't try to hammer down one side completely, then move on to the others. With a half-lap cross brace in place, it's time to clamp it so the dado joints are tight. Here I'm using some bar clamps and a few scraps of wood. The scrap wood fits between the cradle frame and the ratcheting corner clamp. Now you can see why I needed that ratchet mechanism offset from the dado. I needed that space free to use a clamp to make sure the glue up was perfect. My cradle bracing was almost a perfect fit. So, very little pressure was needed to secure the glue joint. Which is why I placed the bar clamp jaw on top of the black ribbon of the ratchet strap. Normally, I would advise against doing this, as it might damage the black strap. But every rule has its exceptions. Also, keeping the corner clamps on while the bracing got hammered in, helps to make sure the corners weren't going to be forced apart by the bracing. Now that the glue has dried, it's time to remove the clamps and inspect the cradle for glue squeeze out. If you see any glue that has squeezed out, sand it until it's smooth. The next step is to glue the luan surface to the cradle. This step requires full preparation to execute without problems arising. As you can see, I've got plenty of nails loaded in the nail gun and several clamps ready to go. I roughly mark halfway through the cradle thickness, and transfer those lines to the outer walls. Repeat this step on all 4 corners. And also mark the center of the cross braces on the outer walls as well. We'll need to reference those lines so we can drive the nails with accuracy. Next, add a liberal amount of glue to the cradle, and spread it around as evenly as you can. I'm using my glue up brush, but your finger or just a wood scrap should work just fine. The goal here is just uniform coverage. With the glue spread evenly, lay your luan plywood on top and into the approximate position. Try to leave a little overhang around the top on all sides. We're just going to tack it into place for now. Remember, we don't want to drive any nails into the miter joints at the cradle. We need to be at least 1 inch away from the corner so we don't split or weaken the miter joint. Be sure to stay about 1 inch away from the center where the dado cut is as well. Do this for all sides. With the plywood surface tacked in, use a straight edge to draw lines across the surface connecting the marks you made, indicating the center of each cradle wall. Mark the lines for the center braces as well. Here I've circled the areas at the glue joints where I want to keep nails away from. It's easy to forget while moving fast, trying to get the surface nailed in and clamped before the glue sets up. I drive nails about every 3 to 4 inches, making sure to skip over the circled areas. We'll use clamps to secure those down in just a minute. With the surface nailed in, it's time to look for problem areas where the 𝐒𝐢𝐳𝐞 may not be making good contact with the cradle. Since the corners are not nailed in, you can expect to see it lifted up in those areas. This is not uncommon. Simply grab a clamp and apply pressure until it's seated properly to seal the gap. Continue applying clamps around the edges of the panel and allow it sufficient time for the glue to dry. Remove the clamps, then trim off the excess plywood with a router. Be sure to move slow when cutting across the grain. Fill in the nail holes with the filler of your choice and prepare for the final sanding. All of those steps were covered in my previous video. I'll leave a link to it below. Hi, Billy Rhyze here. If you've made it this far into my video, thanks for watching. I wanted to talk briefly about the cost to benefit ratio of learning to build your own artist panels. There are substantial upfront costs for some of the tools required to follow along. I'll address that in another video. For now I want to focus on the costs of materials to follow along with this project specifically. When I purchased the materials I needed to build this project, I bought 5 poplar boards at 6-foot lengths and a single 4x8 sheet of 𝐒𝐢𝐳𝐞 plywood. The total cost for the materials came out at just over $50. For a grand total of 30 linear feet of poplar and 32 square feet of plywood, purchased from the big box home repair store. The total number of material feet to build this project, including an extra 10% for cut-off scrap, is 14.5 linear feet of poplar. About 5 square feet of plywood. Okay. So what? So, the parts list I gave you at the beginning of this video is less than half the amount of wood purchased. For a little over $50 you can make 2 of these art panels at this size. Here is the cost and general fabrication of a similarly sized product, available for purchase at one of the largest art supply retailer stores here in the US. I'm not trying to shame anyone here, only point out that twice the amount of product can be built to a higher standard, at about the same cost once you factor in taxes and shipping. To put a fine point on all of this, let's look at this from the perspective of the potential art buyer. Let's pretend these 2 panels are the same size. They have the exact same painting on the other side and were painted by the same artist. The gallery selling them to you is insisting you pay the same top dollar for either artwork. All things being equal, which painting do you decide to purchase, and why? This is why having a high standard for professionalism in your work matters from start to finish. You don't want to miss out on a sale due to substandard construction of your supports. And now that you know how to build them better and cheaper than you can buy them, you never will. I hope you learned something from my video today. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more videos. Thanks for watching. I'm Billy Rhyze, and I'll see you next time.